says that these birds are to fly, in other words, upon the face of the expanse. Now, you can fly upon the face of the expanse if it's just universe, if it's just atmosphere. That means you just fly around in there. But it would have to say that the birds were to fly under or below or beneath the expanse of heaven if this is a solid vault or dome. Do you see that? We know that the birds are going to be flying around, according to this verse, in that area rather than below that area. We know they fly around in the atmosphere, in heaven, that is the first heaven, not below it. And if this firmament back here should be firmament, it should be represent a vault or a metallic dome, then here in Genesis 1:20 it would have to say, let the fowl fly above the earth underneath or below the firmament of heaven. Because you'd have to say underneath that dome or you'd get in outer space then. But this shouldn't be what we have in King James. It should be that may fly above the earth upon the face of the expanse of heaven. If you can't get that written in your Bible or in your margin, then right now, then you can at least get it down on paper and then change it later. Well, let's just look at the times here in the Bible where it needs to be changed. Now, we've got a class, dear friends, in the future that we're going to teach you on biblical and extra-biblical literature, where we'll look at the various versions and translations and manuscripts of the Bible. But let it suffice now to say that there's no version that's perfect. And when we come across something that needs to be changed, then we're going to change it. For all the obvious reasons that we can't get into this evening, we are going to continually stay with the King James Version, even though on occasions you may find something better in the NIV or NASB or RSV or ASV or some other translation. We're going to stay with the King James. But where we come across something that needs to be changed, then we're going to give you that change so you can write it in your Bible, not be confused by that. Okay, Genesis 1:6. You'll have to change your A to an N because now you've got a word that starts with a vowel rather than a consonant. And God said, let there be an expanse. Verse 7, God made the expanse. I'm just going to show you where you'll need these changed. Then two other times in the same verse, divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. Verse 8, and God called the expanse heaven. Verse 14, I think there are 9 times here in Genesis 1. God said, let there be light in the expanse of heaven. Verse 15, let them be for lights in the expanse. Verse 17, God set them in the expanse. And then the one we just gave you in the end of verse 20, a lot of the end of the verse needs to be changed. Rather than in the open firmament, it should be upon the face of the expanse. Upon the face of the expanse of heaven. Okay, then moving on in the Bible, Psalm 19 and verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse showeth his handiwork. There is one verse over in Job that talks about, well, they think it talks about the heavens there. It really doesn't. It talks about it having a look as a molten looking glass. But if we get a chance, we'll cover that verse some other time. It's over in the book of Job. I don't remember where, but I'm sure it's toward the end where we get into some of the nature discussions there in the end of Job. And it's referring to the clouds. I'll just let you know ahead of time, rather than the firmament or the expanse there. But it talks about it having a face like a molten looking glass. And there you think of something metallic that's reflecting something back to you, which is simply not the case. Psalm 150 in verse 1. Then over in Ezekiel 1, I think there are several places here. This is Ezekiel's vision of the living creatures, which he calls later in chapter 10 the cherubim, and of course the wheel within a wheel, and the great throne that he sees here. Ezekiel 1, 22, and the likeness of the expanse upon the heads of the living creature. Ezekiel 1:22. 23, and under the expanse were their wings straight. Verse 25, there was a voice from the expanse that was over their heads. In verse 26, and above the expanse that was over their heads. Let's see, then we got another place here, chapter 10 and verse 1, which is a similar account to verse 1, and you tie these two chapters together and you understand them better. But it's referring to the same expanse. Verse 1, then I looked, and behold, in the expanse that was above the head of the cherubim. There you'd have to mark off the S. No such thing as cherubims. And of course, we couldn't go through all the verses on the cherubim right now, because they're everywhere. Back in the book of Exodus, here in Ezekiel, Isaiah 6 with your seraphims, and a lot of things that we're going to change whenever we get around to it. And Daniel 12, I believe, is the last passage. Daniel 12:3. They that be wise, or teachers, shall shine as the brightness of the expanse. They that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. So what we've got here on the second day of creation, then, is the creation of the atmosphere. He calls it, first of all, the expanse, and then he gives it a particular name, and that is heaven. Remember, this would be the first heaven now. The third heaven and the second heaven have already been created back in verse 1. Now we have the first heaven, which is our atmosphere. Now there are some verses that we want to look at here in the Old Testament, starting with Job 9:8, that talk about him stretching out the heaven. And all of these will be referring, at least in part, if not in whole, to the atmosphere that we're talking about here on the second day of creation. Job 9:8, which alone spread out the heaven. Now there we should have spread out, rather than stamp out or beat out, where it would refer to something solid. Spread them out, and that is, he's spreading out the atmosphere. Zechariah 12:1. The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens, layeth the foundation of the earth, and formeth the spirit of man that is within him. Isaiah 42 and verse 5. There are several passages in Isaiah, beginning with 42 and verse 5. Thus saith the Lord God, he that created the heavens and stretched them out. That gives you the idea of the atmosphere, rather than a molten looking glass or something like that. That he has stretched out the atmosphere to completely surround the surface of the earth. 44:24. Thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone. 51:13. And forgettest the Lord thy Maker, that hath stretched forth the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. Then in two places of Scripture, Isaiah 40:22 and Psalm 104:1-2, the analogy of stretching out a curtain is given in comparing that with the heavens. Isaiah 40, we'll just take the middle of verse 22, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, or just like a blanket, and that's what the atmosphere does. It's like a blanket or a curtain that rests right up on top of the earth, many miles thick, but it still separates the earth from outer space. And then the other passage was Psalm 104, verses 1 to 2. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, and who stretchest out the heavens like a curtain. And then one other text, Jeremiah 10:12, tells us how God did this. It says he did it by his discretion. Verse 12, Jeremiah 10. He hath made the earth by his power. He hath established the world by his wisdom. And he hath stretched out the heavens by his discretion. So we've got his power, his wisdom, and his discretion in forming the world and its atmosphere. Presently, dry air, pure dry air, is composed of the following elements: 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% argon, and then small amounts of carbon dioxide, helium, hydrogen, neon, xenon, and krypton. That gets over into our royal gases. Just small, insignificant amounts. All of them on the small ones: carbon dioxide, hydrogen, helium, neon, xenon, Xenon, and krypton, Krypton. Now that, I said, is our present composition of pure dry air. You see, you thought air was all oxygen there. Very little of it is oxygen. Most of it is nitrogen. Also at this time, now we're talking about present conditions here because these would not have necessarily been true in the Genesis account. We have three basic layers in the atmospheric realm. Now the atmosphere extends above the earth just for miles and miles and miles. The first 6 to 10 miles are where most of our gases are found. Most of your oxygen and all of your other gases here are found within the first 6 to 10 miles of our atmosphere, that is, above the surface of the earth. But the atmosphere extends for miles and miles and miles. I don't even remember how far up before we get into outer space. The atmosphere is the highest over the equator, and of course that would make it the lowest over the poles. And that, of course, is due to the fact of the temperature there. You're going to have contraction over the poles and expansion over the equator. But as I said, it's composed of these levels. First of all, we have the troposphere. And this is where our weather conditions occur. All of your storms and things like this occur within the troposphere, which of course is the part of the atmosphere in which we live. It extends down to the earth. The second level is the stratosphere. And this is, oh, by the way, they're in the troposphere. As, of course, you probably know this, as you go up in elevation from the surface of the earth and the air gets colder and colder. For every 300 feet up, you drop 1 degree Fahrenheit in temperature. So by the time we get up to the stratosphere, which is above the troposphere, it is very, very cold with only a few gases found here in the stratosphere. As a matter of fact, all but 1/1,000,000th of the Earth's atmosphere is found below the stratosphere. All but 1 million is found below the stratosphere, to show you it's getting practically empty up there. That's why you have pressurized cabins in planes and rockets and things like this. Then thirdly, now these are the three basic levels and layers that we have. The ionosphere. This, of course, is where we have our electrically charged particles known as ions. I-O-N-S. What do ions do? Who knows what ions do? They're electrically charged particles. They are the things that make possible radio transmission all over the earth. These ions in the ionosphere are what make possible the transmitting of radio signals and TV signals and things like this. And it's also in this ionosphere where your northern lights, which are caused by charged particles from the sun, occur, that you can see in this part of the country. That particular phenomena in nature occurs not in the troposphere or the stratosphere, but up in the ionosphere. Now, as you know, let's go back to Genesis 1 here. The earth at the very beginning has been nothing but a ball of water, and it does not have any mist. Now, some people think of a mist floating around the outside of it, hovering over the water. It has no mist at all. The only thing that we have is water that's held together by gravity in the center of the earth, and then as soon as you go beyond the surface of the earth, you're already into outer space at this particular time here, or before the second day of creation. But there's not a little mist like you'd read in some of your ancient accounts of the origin of all things, where there was a mist and dragons swimming and mist floating and it was dark and things like this. You don't have that here. What we've got is the circular ball, as you had a picture of, I believe, of water. When God says, let there be an expanse, he simply lifts up, we don't know how much, but he lifts up the outer surface of the earth, which is water. He extends that out way beyond the earth, and in between that region of water and the earth, he puts the expanse, or the heavens, and this is where we have these various gases that we've just been talking about. Now, does everyone understand what I'm talking about there? You need to understand this. This is the way that God went about it in creating the atmosphere and the earth, and of course that'll have things to do later on with the flood. So you've got this division, and you've got just a huge reservoir of water now up above this expanse, most of which, of course, is not around today. Now, let's see. Where do we come? God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. We've been looking at this expanse. It means the atmosphere. Let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, that tells us right away we're going to have a division of waters from waters. Now, you have no problem with the bottom waters. You know that goes back to verse 2, the deep, the Tehom, and the waters, the Mayim. That's the composition of the earth at this time. So whenever we've got this separation, there's no problem with raising the question, well, what were the waters below the expanse? That was the earth at this time. But a problem comes in when asking the question, what are those waters above the expanse? God made the expanse, divided the waters which were under the expanse. That was our earth at that time. From the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. So we raise the question, what are the waters above the expanse? There are three views in this area. First of all, it represents God throwing water into outer space. Secondly, it refers to the clouds. What are the waters above, in other words? And there are a lot of scriptures that are adduced in support of the cloud theory of the waters above, which are easily discounted with a little understanding from the Word of God. And which we're not going to get into, we'll do in a later message. And the third, and the biblical, and I can even say the recent view, because it's something that's not been, it's old as Genesis, but people simply haven't seen it, and that is that these waters above represent a whole celestial vapor canopy that surrounded the earth at this time. A celestial vapor canopy. Now, if you don't understand what that means, that's okay. One thing that does mean is you haven't read any yet in the Genesis flood, which you don't have to be. If you're not, that's fine. But if you don't understand that, we will be explaining that later on. It's the biblical view, even though, as I said, it's rather recent, because most people, the traditional view, by the way, John Calvin's commentaries, H.C. Leupold's commentaries, state that the waters above refer to the clouds, that this was the time when God lifted up the clouds. The problem with that is, very clearly in verse 7, there's a lot of problems, I'm just going to give you one here, but it clearly says that God is going to make an expanse, which we know to be the atmosphere, to separate the waters below from the waters above. Now, if the waters above are clouds, clouds aren't above the expanse, clouds are in the expanse. They're in the atmosphere. They're part of the atmosphere. It clearly had to be something beyond the earth's atmosphere. And it had to be something very similar to the waters that we have here on earth, the Tehom or the Mayim, back in verse 2 of Genesis 1. So that ought to be enough for someone. It's not for them, but it should be enough to let them know this could not refer to clouds that have been lifted up. Yes? No. For the most part, no. We'll explain that in the future message, though. There is one verse over in the book of Psalms that they say supports the view that if we believe that this existed then, that it still has to exist today. But that's reading over everything in between Genesis 1 and Psalm 148, where that verse is found, where we're told a lot of other things there. But if this is news to you, then just hold on and we'll explain that when we get there. Is there any other questions that relate to that before we go on? It's a whole ocean. It's in vapor form, but nonetheless it's a whole ocean that existed all around the Earth's atmosphere, up above the Earth's atmosphere. That'll be in the future. Yeah, there's a good reason why. It's the same reason, by the way, why this is the only day of creation that God does not say, and it was good. Remember, he says it 6 times. The 7th time, he says it's very good. But he says it 6 times, but those 6 times when he says it is good do not fall at the end of each day of creation, because in day 3, where we have 2 specific events, we've got 2 times that he says that it's good, and no reference is made on the 2nd day of anything being good that he's made. And there's a reason for that, too. The same reason why the waters above exist. Okay, let me give you a twofold purpose for the expanse. First of all, as we've been covering, it's to divide the waters from the waters. The twofold purpose for the expanse. To divide the waters from the waters. And then if you say, as you just did, well, why did he divide the waters from the waters? We can't answer that right now. And then secondly, to provide a suitable environment for life. He has to do this before he's going to start day 3 of creation. Verse 8, and so God called the expanse heaven. This is the first heaven. 2 of them have already been created back in verse 1. The evening was, the morning was, day 2. So there's the 2nd day of creation, all wrapped up in the subject of this expanse that he's making to separate the waters below from the waters above. Provides us with an atmosphere that is not entirely like ours today, but similar, like the one in which we live. Any questions on day 2? If not, we're going to go on to day 3 and at least start on it. Day 3 of creation is found in verses 9 through 13, and it's divided right in the middle, right in half, because there are 2 events that take place. First of all, dry land, and secondly, vegetation. the creation of dry land, then the creation of vegetation. These two things occupy the third day. After each of these events, first of all, the creation of dry land, and secondly, the creation of vegetation, then God does say it's good. And that's why we have this repetition, it is good, doubled up on the third day of creation. No mention of it back on the first day. Okay, verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven. Okay, now this is the waters that the whole earth was composed of at this time. Remember how I showed you back from verse 1, he talks about the heavens and the earth, then he drops the heavens, and he goes on and talks about the earth. And he does this on several occasions. Then what we just studied, he talks about the waters above, the waters below. Now he drops the waters above. He's continually zeroing in on earth and preparing it for man's habitation. So he drops the waters above. Now he's going to talk about the waters below. And he said, let the waters under the heaven. Now that's the expanse that was just made. Now you see King James capitalized heaven in verse 8 and gave it to us with a small letter in verse 9. So that's inconsistent. I mean, do it one way or the other. Let the waters, the mayim, under the expanse be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. Now Moses, well, we'll go on and read the rest. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening was, and the morning was, day 3. So verses 9 to 10, we have dry land. Verses 11 to 12, we have vegetation. In verse 13, we have the conclusion. Again, 5 verses. Like on the first day of creation, we're given 5 verses here. And these two different things taking place. Now Moses has reverted back to a general pattern that we didn't see on day 2, but that we saw on day 1, and we see here again on day 3, a general pattern of describing creation that went something like this. It had 5 steps to it. First of all, he gives us the divine speech, represented by the words, and God said. Now this is not always true on every day, but it's true on several of the days. Secondly, he gives us the fiat, represented by the words, let there be. Number 3, he gives us the fulfillment, represented by the words, and there was. Fourthly, he gives us the divine judgment, represented by the words, and God saw that it was good. Fifthly, he gives us the conclusion, represented by the words, the evening was, the morning was. So he gives us the divine speech, the fiat, the fulfillment, the judgment, and the conclusion. Represented by the words, and God said, let there be, there was, God saw that it was good, evening was, morning was. You see how simple and how this is so totally foreign to any type of mythology or paganism in here, because it's given to us in such a simple and straightforward manner. It just says, and God said, let there be, and there was, and God saw that it was good, and that was the end. Now, if it's going to be mythology, they're going to blow it up into something. This is just another proof that this is a straightforward narrative account that God expects us to believe and to take literally, because it's given in such simple, while at the same time majestic form. Because these 5 points here show you, when he follows his plan, that it is very majestic. the whole time with its purpose of extolling and lifting up the Creator rather than the creation, because it always mentions the Creator first by saying, and God said, let there be, and then the Creator creates something which becomes His creation. Now we're only going to go, I guess, a few more moments here. We can't get too far into this. Let's go back to verse 1 to tie verse 1 in with what we just saw in verses 6 to 8. Now remember, it says here in verse 1, not only as the caption, but as the first event of creation, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now in one of our problems that we raised earlier, remember we went down to verse 8 and said, but how can the heavens be made in verse 1 when here the heavens are made in verse 8 and now the earth is made in verse 10? Remember when we said that? Well, you understand what he's saying here. It's very easy to see. The heavens in verse 1 refer to the third and the second heaven, and then we've got the first heaven made in verse 8. In verse 1, again, he gives us the earth. Remember I told you that it could be used in three different senses. It could refer, the word earth, eretz, could refer to the whole globe, which is what it refers to in verse 1. God made the globe. Now it was a watery structure, not solid, but nonetheless God made the globe, and he called it the earth. Secondly, it can refer to dry land, which it's going to in our account here. And then thirdly, it can apply to some specific country or specific parcel of land, such as a field. Now, as soon as you understand that, then you see that there's no contradiction between verse 1 saying that God created the earth, and then verse 7 saying, and now God made the earth. It's because in verse 1 he's referring to the whole globe. In verses 9 to 10 he's referring to dry land. And then he calls that earth. This isn't really a true comparison, but it's the same as having New York, New York. New York is the city, and New York is the state also. Earth is the whole state, the whole sphere, but the earth also is just that dry land. New York is the whole state, but New York also is that one city. We don't say, oh, there's a contradiction, there can't be two New Yorks. We understand, well, one of them refers to the state, and one of them refers to the city. Very easy. One of the earths here, so many people have a problem with that. One of the earths in verse 1 refers to the globe. We get down in verses 9 and 10, we've got another account here. This refers to the creation of dry land. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. Okay, today, again, we're going to give you what we have today, and then we'll go back to this time period. Today, we have 7 continents, and we have 4 great seas, or oceans, as we call them. You ought to remember this now from first or second or whenever they teach you grade in school. 7 continents. Do I need to name those 7, or do all of you know them? Name them. North America, South America, Europe. If you don't know them, you can write them down. Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. And what are the 4 great seas or oceans? Atlantic, Pacific, no, Mediterranean, the sea, Indian, Arctic. You've got 4 oceans, 7 continents. Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic, Indian. You've got North and South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica for the 7 continents. Now the reason we're saying that is because of what he says here in verse 9. Now we've got 7 continents, and he said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. Now, if all the waters are gathered together in one place, that would mean one ocean, and that would mean one landmass. Now, if he said, let the waters be gathered in 4 areas, then we could end up with our 7 continents that we have today. And so Christian geologists have seen this in verse 9, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and the dry land appear. And right away, they reasoned then that at the very beginning, there was one huge supercontinent that's known to the geologists as Pangaea, P-A-N-G-E-A. Now, of course, I'll explain some more about that here in a moment, because we're going to have to explain a few things to you here in geology, and just need to write as quickly as you can to get everything down so that you can understand it. If all the waters are gathered together in one place, then the only result that we can have is that we have one landmass. If we had one landmass then, but we obviously don't today, then something must have happened that caused them to break apart, and this is a very controversial but popular theory known as the continental drift theory. How many of you have heard of the continental drift theory? Okay, good. We're going to get into that and explain some of that to you. So don't watch me here. Please write. I always warn you, don't watch me. Especially here, you want to get this down, because I don't have this written down, so if once I say it, I might not remember how I said it the first time. In geology, there is a sub-study in geology known as the study of tectonics. T-E-C-T-O-N-I-C-S, which is the study of the Earth's plates upon which the land structures move. Now, that is all valid. It's very obvious that the Earth does rest upon plates. This is what causes our earthquakes that we have, where you have a fault. You've either got plates separating, or you've got, or something even worse than that, plates meeting together. And there are even places out west in Nevada right now where they've had a change in the tectonics of the Earth, and you've got portions of land that have simply dropped. And I mean, just like an earthquake, they haven't opened up, but they simply dropped like 7 feet. And you can walk right up to it, and there was the Earth 7 feet now above you that was level with the ground on which you're standing. It's because one of those plates now has dropped. Now, there are 2 different types of crusts that we have. The Earth, of course, on the outside is the crust. Then inside you have the mantle, and inside that you have the core. And there are 2 different types of crusts on the Earth's surface. You have the continental crust, which is obviously what the continents are made up of, dry land. It's relatively thick, on the order of 25 to 30 miles thick, but it's composed of very light minerals that are composed of very light elements, such as silicon and aluminum. Now, that's one type of crust, continental crust. The second type of crust is your oceanic crust, the crust at the bottom of the ocean that the oceans rest upon. In contrast to the continental crust, it's relatively thin, 4 to 6 miles thick, and it's composed of minerals of heavy elements such as magnesium. Now, with this in view, the continental drift theory states that since the continent's crust is rather light and the ocean's crust is rather heavy, then the continents are able to float across the top of the crust of the oceans, and this is what is known as the continental drift theory. Now, the reason we're bringing this up is because so many Christian geologists believe this, and they've got some basis for it, or what they think, here in Genesis 1:9. Now, getting back to what I said, there at the very beginning was one supercontinent known as Pangaea. It then broke up into 2 subcontinents that are called protocontinents. Any of you remember the names of those proto-continents? There were two of them, a northern and a southern one. The northern one's name was Laurasia. 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 And it contained North America, Greenland, Europe, and Asia. And this was the northern proto-continent. The name of the southern one is rather long. It's Gondwanaland. Gondwanaland. Have you heard of any of those names before? Okay, that first one was a great supercontinent. It broke up to Laurasia and Gondwanaland. Gondwanaland was composed of South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. Now this took place millions and millions of years ago. They tell us today that there is evidence that the continents are even moving today, but the rate of movement is only a few centimeters, not inches, a few centimeters per year. Now that just goes beyond any average person's imagination, and it goes beyond mine. How are you going to know that a continent moved to the east or west several centimeters? How do you not know that part of the beach or something was dissolved by the pounding of the waves against it? How do you know that the continent moved that way? But they have dreamed up this theory that the continents are shifting and have been shifting for millions and millions of years, several centimeters per year. And of course, their proof for this, the Christians' proof, of course, is here in Genesis 1:9. And there's another verse that I'll give you here in a moment. And also on a basis of a look at the continents and how they allegedly fit together. It's well known that the eastern coast of South America fits quite nicely into the western coast, or the Cape Coast, the Ivory Coast of the continent of Africa. There you see them fitting together. And just as well, the eastern seaboard of the United States fits rather nicely onto the northwestern part of the African continent. And so they say that that's just showing you North and South America and Africa, how they could fit together. Now we've got a map up here. You can come and look and see how it looks like they fit right in there together with each other. This is a picture of Pangaea here in the very beginning, where you've got all the continents that are hooked to each other in one big landmass known as the supercontinent. And then, over a period of time, they begin to break apart and break up from one another, and they floated, literally floated. Of course, see, it's because the crust of the continent is light, because it's made up of light elements, and it can just float right across the top of the ocean floor. And so they simply separated and floated, thousands and thousands of miles apart from each other. Another proof from the Bible is over in Genesis 10, verse 25. Let me say right away that, I'll say that in a moment. Genesis 10:25, and unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And they say that this verse right here refers to the beginning of the separation of Laurasia and Gondwanaland from the original supercontinent that they had, that existed in the very beginning. Now we'll deal with that verse later on, but it obviously refers to the division of the earth in chapter 11. Not a physical division of the earth, but a national division of all these different people that are here in Genesis 11. That's easy to see, and that's easy to prove when we get there. But they'll use that verse, in his days was the earth divided, to teach the continental drift theory. Well, there are several things wrong with this. First of all, it takes millions of years to do that, and the earth simply has not been here that long. Now, of course, they don't believe that we can prove that from Scripture, but we can. But if that takes millions of years, it rules it out. The earth hasn't been here millions of years to give them time to float and separate. Besides that, I want you to notice verse 10. Oh, I like verse 10 because they give us seas in the plural here. Now it said up in verse 1, let the waters be gathered together in one place. That doesn't mean one big super sea, though. It just means let the waters occupy the watery places and let dry land occupy the continental places. But when it gives us seas in the plural, which it does in the Hebrew, and which we have here in the English, right away, if the seas are plural, then the land masses have to be plural also. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, which is the word yamin, Y-A-M-I-N, and God saw that it was good. So we've got a plurality of seas here. Now, just as a footnote to what we've said thus far, do not misconstrue in your mind in thinking that these continents, as you can see them up here on the map, look exactly the same as they did when God first made them here in Genesis, because they don't. They were not all joined together in a supercontinent. But, and we'll be saying more about this later on, at that time the seas weren't nearly as deep as they are today, and we had much more land area.
For a complete list of Brother Ross's tapes and books,